G'day everyone, Viv here. I hope you're all keeping well. Welcome back. It's time for the next table build. This time I've got our new Ruins of Ilaria range. Well, that's its current working aim. I don't know if that's what it will be called. That we've been working on over the last couple of months, and I've spent the last week and a half or so, 2 weeks, painting up this new 4x4 table. I've used some fences from the Letters Home range, some of those wrought iron fences from the Letters Home range. I've made a custom baseboard, and obviously assembled and painted these new ruined kits. These do come as an intact version as well. So for each of the models that you see here on the table, there's an intact version and a ruined one. And I've chucked some of our Mirrors of Talan figures, currently unreleased, sitting on the table for the aesthetics of it. So this process was a huge amount of fun. I've got loads more to paint, and I'm really looking forward to doing them. It was just so enjoyable. I started by making some custom laser engraved baseboards for the bases. Now, I've lost my footage, unfortunately, of me putting these boards and gluing them down to a piece of 12mm MDF, etc. But whatever. I went ahead and cut up some bits of MDF strips. Now, you could use some foam core or some cardboard or whatever you want for this. Balsa wood. And I had a couple of different widths, 6mm, 6.5, and 7mm. So you can see along the edge of the gutter there's some variation in the thickness of this gutter. And I think that just helps add to the visual interest. I simply glue them down with some PVA and then wipe up the excess glue with that paintbrush so I don't get a weird bead along there. I use this granite effect from Dulux, from their Duramax range, to give the whole board, including all the roads and everything, a very light dust with this material. It's going to add some texture for me later on. Not a huge amount, just enough to be able to add a little bit of extra interest other than just the engraving itself. Flat black spray, as always. All terrain gets sprayed black. It doesn't matter if it's going to be white in the end, it still gets sprayed black. It's just probably part habit, and as I've mentioned in other videos, it really helps highlight and define some shadows for us. Grey over the top of that. This is the Fiddly Bits grey primer, and I'm just spraying it on very gently and in some patchy areas, adding a modulated effect to the board. It helps, it works. I don't need to put down a big grey base coat over the top of that black. I do want that black and the grey to show through. I'm using this cold metal. I think this is from British Paints, maybe Dulux, I can't quite remember. Through the big airbrush outside. I do have some issues with this airbrush as I'm doing this, as I always seem to have whenever I'm using it. It sprays a huge amount of paint, and it collects on the front of the nozzle just like a normal airbrush does. And if you don't keep it clean, it either starts blocking up your airbrush or it drips. And in this case, as you can see, it's dripped all over the table. And that big patch at the top of the screen there becomes an issue for me a little bit later on. But I'm trying to match here the test models that we painted earlier this year, maybe late last year. And I think these colors are going to work. Those were done with spray paints, but I'm trying to do the board here without the spray paints, just simply because it's such a massive area. I take this Baker White and dry brush the whole board. It doesn't really look like it's achieving anything, but it is. It's kind of very difficult to tell in the video. The effect is quite subtle, but it's certainly there. Excuse me. Now, I find some models in the studio that we did previously in some of the previous tutorials. You can see there the intact version and the ruined version of this model here that we're calling a chapel, because it kind of looks like a chapel. And just assessing, how do things, blend. I come to the realization that the table needs a little bit of weathering. Now, before we come back to that, you would have noticed there that the cobblestone roads have already been weathered. I don't know what happened to the footage. I'm trying to be extra careful with my file management, but it's gone. So I basically took some exterior decking stain, a water-based decking stain. I thinned that stain with a little bit of water, brushed it onto the table, and then mopped up the excess. And now we are where we are at the moment. I use some of this weathering spray, which I'm trying to move away from, which is why I'm using the decking stains, because that weathering spray is no longer available. I simply take a wet rag and wipe it off essentially. You know, that product is designed to be used like this. You can spray it onto something and then wipe off all the excess, and you're left with some of that pigmentation on the surface of what you've sprayed it on. It works, it kind of doesn't work. I'm in two minds about whether I'd use the decking stain in the future or continue to use that spray or something similar. And then I come back again with Baker White to just dry brush, try and blend in some of that patchiness, which kind of works, it kind of doesn't work, but you know, at least I'm redefining my gutters. Now, before I start painting and texturing and, you know, getting the models finished, I need to make sure they look like ruins. And one of the big problems with MDF models is, you know, we can only cut in a parallel, you know, vertical surface. So you can see the difference here between the original model and the one that I've gone through and taken chunks out of and attacked, basically. Now, you could do this with a good knife, a nice strong knife, some files. I'm going to primarily use a Dremel because it's much easier, it's much faster. I've got a metal cut-off blade on here and it seems to work. Now, make sure you're wearing a good respirator when you're using a Dremel on MDF because there's a lot of dust and MDF particles are not good to breathe in. The knife, I attacked this model with the knife for probably all of about 15 seconds before I'm like, nah, bugger this, I can't be bothered. It's not going to work as efficiently as I want it to. And then I take a triangular shaped file and try to, you know, file grooves and edges into the model. It works, but again, the effect is very subtle and it's going to take a long time. I've got around a dozen models to do and it's just not going to cut it. So eventually I say, look, you know, I give up because I do have a Dremel. And then there we go. Cut off disc on the Dremel, very gently on the edges of the model, just dragging that cutting bit around, and it's ripping up this model like nobody's business. You know, I put some big gouges in there, some deep grooves, you know, running across all the edges of the model where obviously it would be ruined, and trying to just add an extra layer of visual interest to the model and try to get away from that, yeah, this is an MDF model look. Now, I wanted to customize this model, so I found a massive saw and tried to cut off this roof section. It was very difficult with this big saw. So I thought, you know, let me try a couple of other things. It didn't work. Give up. So I went and found a small hobby saw and I thought this might work better. Now, the hobby saw worked, but it was also still very difficult. You know, eventually I'm like, well, there's no point me doing this. I've got that Dremel. And so I'll put the Dremel on this model and it will tear it apart. Now, one of the issues that I did face with the Dremel is that I only had a cut-off bit, a metal cut-off bit. I didn't have a bit designed for cutting through wood. So it was a little bit more challenging than it would have normally been if I'd had that cut-off wheel for wood. As I said, I've only got the metal ones. If I had one for wood, it would have been much easier. But I slowly just ground through the pieces that I needed and then eventually just started snapping bits off. You know, at one point here on this roof, I just take it off and snap it straight off and then clean up the edge there so it matches all the rest, you know, just filing it off and, you know, attacking it with that Dremel to, you know, add that visual interest. And you can see the difference. There's the, you know, two models, exactly the same. One looks significantly better than the other. Simply by just rounding off those corners, you know, the model has so much more interest. That, you know, it's something I do every time. During the process of hacking off bits and pieces, I did end up with some other bits which I've glued onto some of these kits just to help fill in detail where the model doesn't come with them. I also use some of those bits to create extra pieces, which we'll see possibly later on. Duramax again, the granite effect over the whole model. You know, again, just to help add interest and detail. Yes, the outside of the building is engraved and we have arches and interior windowsills and details on the inside, but, you know, I wanted that extra detail. Whole bunch of basing materials. I've got some aquarium gravel there, some cat litter, some sand. In the cup behind the PVA bottle is a bag of little bricks that we sell on our website. This is a bag of scrap rubbish that comes from the bottom of the lasers after we cut up our kits. And so I fished out some of that stuff. And, you know, blobs of pure PVA. Starting off with my biggest basing material first, which was the cat litter, and then I move on to finer and finer materials to fill in the gaps. So that aquarium sand, the aquarium gravel, and the sand just to fill in that detail. And I go through all the models like this, adding blobs of glue here and there around the place and sprinkling on my basing materials. For the roof, I didn't think that would be necessary to have any bricks or rubble or anything up there, but for lower floors, balconies, I start throwing in some of those little bricks, some of that scrap material, what would you call it, rubble material, and just loading up the model with the rest of the basing material. You know, I'm trying to represent the fact that, you know, there could be smashed up furniture inside there. There could be, you know, bricks and rubble and stone and all that sort of stuff. And I'm trying to keep this layer of rubble relatively flat because I don't want it to interfere with gameplay too much. You know, I still want the majority of the model to be usable. In reality, these buildings would be full of rubble. Or, you know, it'd be very, very difficult to move around in there. But from a gameplay perspective, we need access. And we need to be able to put our miniatures where we want to be able to put them. So it's just a matter of going through, you know, adding glue where you want it. In hindsight, I wouldn't add any rubble to the top of the MDF walls. It kind of looks a little bit weird having that sprinkling of gravel and sand on top of those walls where, you know, those would be big stone blocks. And, you know, big stone blocks aren't going to break down into tiny, tiny bits of rubble like that. Once I've done all of that, it's time to seal all of this stuff in place as best as we can. Some of it's going to move, and if it's going to move, it's not meant to be there. But I go ahead and get some PVA and water. It's 50-50 mix. Spray down my area with some isopropyl alcohol and some water, again in a 50-50 mix in that spray bottle. I spray that on there just to break up the surface tension. Now this is an area, you know, part of the process where you want to be slightly careful. I do have an issue with warping one of the pieces. And it's the piece that I cut up. All of the others were perfectly fine. The stock models, the one that I decided to cut up and customize became a bit of a problem for me. And we'll have a look in a different video later on about how we can address some of these issues that we face with, you know, MDF warping when we've got too much liquid drying on the surface of a wooden product. Nothing to fear here in terms of swelling or anything like that. You know, MDF doesn't do that. Unless it's been soaking and soaking and soaking for ages and ages and ages. Black, as always, like I said before, I spray the models upside down first so I can get underneath the archways and the door frames and all that sort of stuff, and then I go ahead and spray the rest of the model. Quick dusting with that grey, so far exactly the same process as I've used on the table. Black, grey, again just misting this model, dusting it. I'm looking for that modulated effect where I can see both of the colours through the black undercoat and the grey. I'm loving these paints. The MTM 94, here we're using Balboa grey, which you know, we're again spraying onto these models just very, very gently. You know, we want the layers that we're putting on to work for us, to help us, you know, add definition and depth to our model. You can see here that there is a significant difference, whilst it might not look like it as I'm applying it, between the grey primer and this Balboa grey once you get it on there. And already the models are looking great. Take Stardust Grey, again from the MTN 94 range, and I spray this all over the model. You could do this with similar coloured paints and simply dry brush this on there if you didn't want to use rattle cans. I try to do the inside of the model first and then put the model together and then do the outside. That way I get a consistent look on the outside. If I did the two floors separately, there's a chance that, you know, one floor could be brighter than the other and it would just look weird. So I spray the inside of the models first, then I spray the outside. As I've shown in many of the tutorials before, I love this water-based decking stain from Cabot's. This is their walnut, and depending on how much you thin this will depend on how dark your weathering will be. And in this case, you know, I add a little bit more of that decking stain, and then I go through and liberally spread this material all over the place, all over my piles of rubble, and up in between the corners of the walls, and anywhere where I think, you know, dust and mud and splatter or whatever is going to accumulate and build up, you know, in a city that's been under siege or destroyed or ruined multiple times, like Osgiliath from Lord of the Rings. It's a beautiful city that's been utterly destroyed, that there's going to be so much dust and debris everywhere, that whilst we still want this to be playable, we still want that representation of an old city. So piling this stuff on there and then simply mopping it up and moving it around with paper towels and brushes and my fingers really helps, you know, provide that sort of, you know, aesthetic or that sort of feeling. And I mop it on there with the brush. I wipe it around with my fingers. I use a piece of tissue paper to mop it up and push and pull and drag it around. And, you know, overall, it's, you know, really helping to add a very quick weathered appearance to this model. Now, I've only done this once, but you could come back again with different dilutions or in fact a different color to add different interest to the model in terms of, you know, how much definition you want that model to have. Once the model is almost approaching completion, I put it back together and again just go over it once to make sure that everything is blending well together. Thanks Scott for that new building that he's just brought in fresh off the laser. And there we go, it's looking pretty good. I go through and I highlight and paint and build and everything. And you know, the table has come up looking great. You know, that same process that I've used for that model, I used on all of them. And you know, it was a very, very quick process, a very fun project. You know, there's loads of stuff you could do to this. I will add lots more to this table over time, but you know, for all intents and purposes, for what it is at right now, it's perfectly fine. It's really usable. It does need some rubble piles. It needs some signs of life, and I'll talk about signs of life in another video where we look at adding things to, especially an urban environment like this, that makes it actually feel like it had people in it at one stage. Yes, it needs rubble piles, but you know, bits and pieces that you'd find, furniture, you know, all the housing accessories and stuff. There would have been plants in this city at one stage, so we need plant pots and planter beds and, you know, perhaps some, you know, weedy, overgrown dirt areas and stuff like that. But you know, it was a fun project. I really enjoyed working on it. I've already started working on the next table. Yeah, I'm just having a whale of a time right now. We've got so many models in our collection that over the last 5 years, I've really neglected playing with them. But I'm going to be taking that chance now and that opportunity to, you know, slow down on the development front a little bit. We don't need to keep making more and more models. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. I'm going to start showing you how to use them, how I use them and what I could do with them. And I'm really looking forward to that process. Thanks for tuning in, guys. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them in the descriptions. And if you haven't subscribed already, please do click that red subscribe button and the bell notification to make sure that you don't miss anything in the future. I'll catch you soon. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.